December 7th, 1941. As Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, their naval commanders were already laughing at America's pathetic submarine fleet, dismissing these underwater vessels as cowardly weapons that posed no real threat to the mighty Imperial Navy. Within 3 years, these same harmless submarines would single-handedly strangle Japan's empire by sinking over 1,400 ships and cutting off the lifeblood that kept their war machine running. But how did America's supposedly weakest naval weapon become Japan's greatest nightmare? And what brutal lesson did it teach about the true nature of power in warfare? December 7th, 1941. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor as Japanese planes screamed through the morning sky. Bombs fell like deadly rain on American battleships. Smoke and fire filled the air, but inside the war rooms of Tokyo, something else was happening. Japanese naval officers were laughing. Admiral Shimizu stood before a large map of the Pacific Ocean. His uniform was perfect. Gold buttons gleamed in the light. Around him sat dozens of other officers. Their faces showed pride and confidence. Japan controlled huge areas of the ocean now. From the beaches of Southeast Asia to the small islands of the Central Pacific, the rising sun flag flew everywhere. "Look at this report," Shimizu said, holding up a piece of paper. "The Americans are sending submarines to fight us." The room erupted in laughter. Officers slapped their knees and shook their heads. One captain wiped tears from his eyes. "Submarines," said Captain Tanaka Hiroshi. He was a destroyer commander with 20 years of experience. "Those underwater coffins? What do they think they can do against our mighty fleet?" More laughter filled the room. Tanaka had seen American submarines before. They were small and slow. Their crews looked scared when they surfaced for air. The Japanese way of fighting was clear and honorable. Big battleships with massive guns faced each other across the waves. Aircraft carriers launched planes for glorious battles in the sky. Real warriors fought face to face. They did not hide underwater like cowards. This was the way of Bushido. This was the way of honor. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku sat quietly in the back of the room. He was older than the others. His face showed deep lines from years at sea. While others laughed, he studied the papers in front of him. Something in his eyes looked worried, but he said nothing. "Sir," a young lieutenant asked Shimizu, "should we worry about these submarine attacks?" The question brought fresh waves of laughter. Shimizu waved his hand as if shooing away a fly. "Submarines are for nations that cannot fight properly," he said. "Look at our empire now. We stretch across thousands of miles of ocean. Our supply ships carry oil from the Dutch East Indies. Rice comes from Southeast Asia. Steel flows from our new territories. The Americans can send all the submarines they want. What can a few underwater boats do against such power?" The officers nodded. It made perfect sense. Japan's empire was huge and strong. Their merchant ships numbered in the thousands. Even if the Americans sank a few vessels, hundreds more would take their place. The math was simple. Japan had too many ships for submarines to matter. But far away from Tokyo, on the other side of the Pacific, American submarine crews were getting ready for war. At Pearl Harbor, men worked day and night to repair the damaged base. In submarine pens, crews loaded torpedoes and checked engines. The boats had names like Wahoo, Tang, and Silversides. They looked small next to the giant battleships nearby. Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan stood on the deck of USS Wahoo. His friends called him Silent Joe because he spoke so little. But his eyes were always watching, always thinking. He looked across the harbor at the smoke still rising from the attack. His jaw was set tight with anger. "How many torpedoes do we have?" he asked his crew chief. 24, sir. All ready to go." Sullivan nodded. He had spent years learning how to hunt ships. His crew had trained in all kinds of weather. They knew how to stay hidden underwater for hours. They could fire torpedoes with deadly accuracy. But the Japanese did not know this yet. Back in Tokyo, the laughter continued. Officers shared stories about American weakness. They talked about their own strong battleships and fast cruisers. Someone brought out sake to celebrate their victories. The war was going perfectly. "I heard the American submarines are so old they barely run," said one captain. "Their torpedoes probably do not even work." The room erupted again. Everyone knew American industry was weak. Their workers were soft. Their machines broke down all the time. Captain Tanaka raised his cup of sake. "To our glorious Navy," he said. "May we sink every American ship that dares to face us in honorable battle." The toast echoed through the room. Dozens of voices joined in celebration. But Admiral Yamamoto still looked troubled. He had visited America before the war. He had seen their factories and cities. Something about their size and power worried him. While others drank, he quietly left the room. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the first report arrived. A Japanese merchant ship had been sunk by torpedo in the Pacific. The name of the attacking vessel was USS Swordfish. In the Tokyo War Room, officers gathered around the message. "One lucky shot," Captain Tanaka said, crumpling up the paper. "The Americans got excited and wasted a torpedo on one old freighter." Others nodded in agreement. One ship out of thousands meant nothing. But Silent Joe Sullivan was already planning his next hunt. Deep underwater, Wahoo moved like a ghost through the dark ocean. On his charts, Sullivan marked the routes where Japanese ships traveled. He studied their schedules and patterns. Every detail mattered in this new kind of war. The Japanese High Command had made their choice. They would ignore the submarine threat and focus on glorious battles between big ships. In their minds, honor mattered more than results. Tradition was stronger than new ideas. They were so sure of their power that they could not see the danger swimming silently beneath the waves. The laughter would not last much longer. February 1942. The waters of the Yellow Sea turned blood red as USS Wahoo surfaced among the wreckage of a Japanese convoy. Silent Joe Sullivan watched through his periscope as 3 merchant ships burned on the horizon. 60,000 tons of cargo and steel now rested on the ocean floor. Oil spread across the waves like a black mirror reflecting the smoke above. In Tokyo, the morning briefing felt different. Admiral Shimizu no longer smiled as he read the reports. The numbers were growing larger each day. 10 ships sunk, then 20, then 50. Captain Tanaka stood beside him, his face pale as he studied the latest messages. "Sir," a young officer said, his voice shaking, "we have lost another convoy near the Philippines. 4 ships this time. The survivors say they never saw the attacker." The room fell silent. No one laughed anymore. But the American submarines were just getting started. At Pearl Harbor, crews worked around the clock to keep the boats moving. Fresh torpedoes arrived on supply ships. New radar equipment was installed in every sub. The Americans had turned submarine warfare into a science. USS Tang prowled the shipping lanes between Japan and Singapore. Commander Richard O'Kane studied his charts like a chess master, planning his next move. Each red X marked a sunken enemy vessel. The marks were spreading across the map like a deadly rash. "Target bearing 030, called the sonar operator. "Sounds like a big one, sir." O'Kane peered through the periscope. A massive oil tanker moved slowly across his view. Behind it sailed two smaller cargo ships filled with rice and steel. Japanese destroyer escorts flanked the convoy, but they were looking in the wrong direction. "Fire tubes 1 and 2, O'Kane ordered. The submarine shuddered as two torpedoes shot toward their targets. 45 seconds later, explosions lit up the night sky. The tanker broke in half and sank within minutes. Thousands of gallons of precious fuel spilled into the sea. Back in Japan, the shortages were starting to bite. Factory workers noticed that steel shipments arrived late. Housewives found that rice became harder to buy. Gas stations ran out of fuel more often, but the government told people not to worry. The war was still going well. Captain Tanaka received new orders. He would command a destroyer escort group protecting convoys from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The route carried oil, rubber, and food that kept the empire running. Tanaka felt confident in his new job. His ship had the best sonar equipment Japan could build. His crew had trained for months to fight submarines. On his first mission, Tanaka sailed with 12 merchant ships and 4 other destroyers. The convoy stretched across 2 miles of ocean. Radio operators chattered back and forth in code. Everyone felt safe with so many warships nearby, but Silent Joe Sullivan was waiting. Wahoo lay hidden beneath the waves like a steel shark. Sullivan had followed this convoy for 2 days, learning its patterns. He knew which ships carried the most important cargo. He knew when the escorts would change course. Most importantly, he knew they could not see him coming. "All stop," Sullivan whispered. His crew moved like ghosts through the submarine. No one made a sound. Outside, the convoy passed overhead. Through the periscope, Sullivan could see the bottom of Tanaka's destroyer just 300 yards away. Sullivan waited until the escorts moved ahead of the merchant ships. Then he struck. 4 torpedoes streaked through the water toward the largest oil tanker. The first explosion sent flames shooting 200 feet into the air. The second torpedo hit the ship's engine room. Within minutes, the tanker was gone. On the bridge of his destroyer, Captain Tanaka felt the shock wave from the explosion. He spun around to see one of his precious cargo ships disappearing beneath the waves. Black smoke billowed across the convoy. Men were screaming in the water. "Where did it come from?" Tanaka shouted at his sonar operator. The young sailor shook his head in confusion. His equipment showed nothing but empty water. The submarine had vanished like a ghost. This same scene played out across the Pacific Ocean hundreds of times. American submarines struck without warning, then disappeared into the depths. Japanese convoy commanders sent frantic radio messages about ghost attacks and invisible enemies. Ship after ship vanished from the sea lanes that connected Japan's empire. In Pearl Harbor, submarine crews celebrated their victories with ice cream and Coca-Cola. Fresh supplies arrived every week from the American mainland. New submarines joined the fleet faster than Japan could sink them. The industrial power of America was like a machine that never stopped running. USS Silversides returned from patrol with her hull painted with small Japanese flags. Each flag represented a sunken enemy ship. Commander Creed Burlingame counted 23 kills in just 60 days at sea. His crew had become experts at finding and destroying Japanese vessels. Meanwhile, in Tokyo war rooms, the mood grew darker each day. Supply officers reported critical shortages of everything from cooking oil to airplane fuel. The great Japanese empire was slowly starving as American submarines cut its supply lines one by one. Admiral Yamamoto studied the reports with growing alarm. Over 400 Japanese ships had been sunk in just 6 months. The Americans were destroying vessels faster than Japan could build them. Their submarine fleet was growing stronger, while Japan's merchant marine was dying. "We must do something," Yamamoto told his staff. "The Americans are strangling us with their underwater fleet." But Captain Tanaka still believed in the old ways. After losing 3 more ships on his second convoy mission, he requested bigger guns and more destroyers. He thought the solution was to fight harder using traditional methods. He did not understand that the rules of war had changed forever. American submarines continued their deadly work. They moved through Japanese waters like invisible hunters, striking at will and disappearing without a trace. Each attack taught them new lessons about their enemy. Each victory made them more confident and deadly. The laughter from those early days in Tokyo was now just a memory. March 1944. The numbers on Admiral Shimizu's desk told a story of disaster. 1,200 Japanese ships rested on the ocean floor. The red ink on his reports showed critical shortages everywhere. No oil for the Navy, no steel for new weapons, no rice for the people. The mighty Japanese Empire was bleeding to death, one torpedo at a time. In his private office, Shimizu stared at a map covered in black X marks. Each mark showed where an American submarine had struck. The marks formed a deadly web across every shipping route from Southeast Asia to Japan. His hand shook as he counted the losses again. The submarines he had laughed at 3 years ago were winning the war. "Sir," his aide said quietly, "the Emperor wants to know why our supplies keep disappearing." Shimizu had no good answer. How could he explain that invisible enemies were destroying Japan faster than any battleship ever could? How could he admit that he had been completely wrong about American submarines? Captain Tanaka faced his own moment of terrible truth. His destroyer escort group was down to 2 working ships. The others had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. Today, he sailed with his last convoy from the oil fields of Borneo. 12 tankers carried the fuel Japan desperately needed. Without this oil, the war would end in weeks. The convoy moved slowly through the South China Sea. Tanaka's radar swept back and forth, searching for submarines. His sonar operators listened for the sound of enemy engines. Every shadow in the water looked dangerous. Every wave could hide a periscope, but USS Tang was already there. Commander O'Kane had tracked this convoy for 3 days. He knew exactly how many ships sailed above him. He knew their speed and direction. Most importantly, he knew this was the last major oil convoy Japan could send. "This is it," O'Kane told his crew. "We sink these tankers, and Japan runs out of fuel." The submarine glided through the dark water like a metal shark. 24 torpedoes waited in their tubes. Each one could send thousands of gallons of oil to the bottom of the sea. O'Kane waited until midnight. Then he struck with deadly precision. The first torpedo hit the lead tanker amidships. Flames shot 300 feet into the night sky. The explosion lit up the entire convoy like daylight. Before anyone could react, 2 more torpedoes found their targets. On the bridge of his destroyer, Captain Tanaka watched in horror as his precious cargo ships turned into floating infernos. Oil spread across the water in burning rivers. The heat was so intense he could feel it on his face from 2 miles away. Men jumped from the burning ships into water that was already on fire. "There!" shouted his lookout, pointing at a periscope cutting through the waves. Tanaka ordered full speed ahead. His destroyer charged toward the submarine like an angry bull, but O'Kane was ready for him. Tang fired her last 2 torpedoes directly at Tanaka's ship. The first torpedo struck the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The second hit the engine room. Tanaka felt his ship lurch violently to one side. Steam and smoke poured from below decks. His proud warship, was dying. "Abandon ship!" Tanaka yelled over the sound of rushing water. He watched his crew jump into the oil-covered sea. Some men were badly burned. Others disappeared beneath the waves before help could reach them. Tanaka was one of the last to leave his sinking ship. As he floated in his life jacket, surrounded by burning oil and screaming men, Tanaka saw something that changed everything. USS Tang surfaced just 50 yards away. The submarine's crew appeared on deck with ropes and life preservers. They were rescuing Japanese sailors from the water. "Over here!" called an American voice in broken Japanese. Strong hands pulled Tanaka from the sea. They wrapped him in a warm blanket and gave him hot coffee. The enemy who had just destroyed his ship was now saving his life. Tanaka stared at his rescuers in shock. These were not the cowards he had imagined. They were professional sailors doing their job. Their submarine was clean and well organized. Their equipment looked years ahead of anything Japan had built. Most shocking of all, they treated their prisoners with respect and kindness. "Why?" Tanaka asked the American officer who bandaged his wounds. "Why do you save us after sinking our ships?" The officer looked surprised by the question. "Because you're sailors, like us," he said simply. "The war is between governments, not between men who go to sea." In that moment, floating in the wreckage of his convoy, Captain Tanaka understood the truth. The Americans had not won through cowardice or luck. They had won through skill, technology, and systematic planning. Their submarines were not underwater coffins, but precision weapons operated by master craftsmen. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Shimizu received the final reports from Tanaka's convoy. All 12 tankers lost. The destroyer escort group destroyed. Japan's last source of oil from Southeast Asia was gone. The war was effectively over, even if the fighting continued. Shimizu walked to his office window and looked out at Tokyo Bay. Once, hundreds of merchant ships had filled this harbor. Now he could count the vessels on his fingers. The bay looked empty and lifeless. The silence was deafening. "We called them cowards," Shimizu whispered to himself. "We laughed at their small submarines while they cut our throat." His reflection in the window showed an old man broken by the weight of his mistakes. The proud admiral who had dismissed American submarines was gone forever. In his prison cell, Captain Tanaka wrote in his diary with shaking hands, "We spoke of honor while they spoke of results. We built beautiful ships while they built victory. Our Bushido taught us to face death bravely, but it did not teach us to see clearly. The Americans showed us that real power moves silently, strikes precisely, and wins completely. We were so busy laughing at shadows that we never saw the sharks swimming beneath our feet." The transformation was complete. Japan's naval leaders finally understood what they faced, but the knowledge had come far too late. September 1945. Captain Tanaka stepped off the train at Tokyo Station and barely recognized his homeland. The great city lay in ruins. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. Rubble filled the streets where proud parades once marched. The smell of smoke and dust hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender just weeks before. The war was over. But as Tanaka walked through the destroyed neighborhoods, he understood that defeat had been decided long before the atomic bombs fell. American submarines had strangled Japan slowly and completely. The empire had starved to death, while its leaders counted battleships. In his pocket, Tanaka carried a life preserver from USS Tang. The American submarine crew had given it to him when they rescued him from the burning sea. The simple piece of canvas and cork had become the most important thing he owned. It reminded him daily of a terrible truth about power and pride. The train station buzzed with conversations about the occupation. American soldiers would arrive soon to rebuild Japan. Former naval officers huddled together, sharing stories of defeat and discussing what went wrong. Many still blamed bad luck or superior American numbers. Few understood the real lesson of their failure. Tanaka met his old friend Admiral Shimizu at a small tea house near the harbor. The once proud admiral looked 20 years older than when the war began. His uniform was threadbare and faded. His face showed deep lines of shame and regret. "Look at what remains of our great fleet," Shimizu said, pointing toward Tokyo Bay. The water held only the rusted hulks of sunken warships. Proud battleships and mighty cruisers sat on the bottom like monuments to failed strategy. The harbor that once bustled with hundreds of merchant vessels now looked like a graveyard. "They sank 1,400 of our ships," Shimizu continued, his voice barely a whisper. 5.3 million tons of steel and cargo. Our beautiful surface fleet fought maybe 20 major battles in 4 years. Their submarines fought 1,000 battles and won almost every one. Tanaka nodded silently. He had spent months in American prisoner camps, studying captured documents about submarine warfare. The numbers told an amazing story. Only 52 American submarines had been lost during the entire war. In return, they had destroyed most of Japan's merchant marine and crippled the empire's ability to fight. The irony cut deep into both men's hearts. Japan had built the largest battleships in the world. Yamato and Musashi were floating cities armed with massive guns. They were supposed to decide the war in glorious ship-to-ship combat. Instead, both giants had been sunk by aircraft, while American submarines did the real work of winning. At the nearby Maritime Academy, former Japanese naval officers were already studying American submarine tactics. Young cadets bent over translated manuals, learning about radar, sonar, and coordinated wolf pack attacks. The very techniques Japan had dismissed as dishonorable were now being taught as the future of naval warfare. "Sir," a student asked his instructor, "why did we not develop these methods ourselves?" The old professor, a veteran of the surface fleet, struggled to find an answer. How could he explain decades of wrong thinking and stubborn pride? Tanaka visited his family home in the mountains outside Tokyo. His wife and children had survived the war, but just barely. They showed him empty rice bowls and told stories of constant hunger. The submarine blockade had made even basic food impossible to find. Children had forgotten what meat tasted like. Adults ate grass and tree bark to stay alive. "The submarines did this," his wife said simply. "Not the bombers or the battles, just the submarines." She did not blame him directly, but Tanaka felt the weight of his mistakes in every word she spoke. In the evenings, Tanaka wrote letters to his former crew members scattered across Japan. Many had died in the final desperate battles of the war. Others had returned home to find their families gone and their cities destroyed. All of them struggled to understand how their mighty empire had fallen so completely. One letter came from a sonar operator who had served on Tanaka's destroyer. "Captain," the young man wrote, "I have been thinking about the American submarines. We always looked for them in the wrong places. We listened for the wrong sounds. They were hunting us while we thought we were hunting them. Maybe that is what power really means. Not the biggest gun or the strongest armor, just seeing clearly and acting smartly." The American occupation forces arrived with their own submarines. USS Balao tied up at Tokyo's main pier, her hull decorated with dozens of small Japanese flags. Each flag represented a sunken enemy ship. Local citizens came to stare at the weapon that had brought down their empire. Children pointed and whispered. Adults stood in respectful silence. Commander William Thompson of USS Palau met with former Japanese naval officers to discuss the transition to peace. Tanaka was amazed by the Americans' knowledge of Japanese tactics and shipping routes. Thompson knew more about Japan's convoy system than most Japanese officers did. "Your submarines were very effective," Tanaka admitted during one meeting. Thompson nodded politely, but did not boast about his victories. "War is about solving problems," the American said. "You had long supply lines that needed protection. We had submarines that could cut those lines. It was not about courage or honor. It was about math and logistics." Years later, when Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force was created, its first major purchase was a fleet of modern submarines. The nation that had once laughed at underwater warfare now embraced it completely. Former enemies became partners in developing new submarine technology. Captain Tanaka eventually became an instructor at the rebuilt Naval War College. On his office wall hung the life preserver from USS Tang, alongside a photograph of his sunken destroyer. Students often asked about the strange display. "This life preserver saved my body," Tanaka would tell them. "But it also saved my mind. It taught me that real strength is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes the greatest power moves silently below, unseen until it strikes." We laughed at American submarines because we measured strength by size and honor by tradition. But power, I learned, is not about what looks impressive. It is about what works. He would pause and look out the window at Tokyo Bay, where new submarines trained alongside old allies. The Americans did not just sink our ships. They sank our assumptions about warfare itself. In our laughter, we revealed not their weakness, but our own blindness to a changing world. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate an enemy's unconventional strength, and never let pride blind you to uncomfortable truths. The laughter had stopped forever.